Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not align with either party, and if you are one of the majority who feels we need more choices on the ballot than red and blue, we believe two parties is too few, and talk about the dysfunction in our current system and how we can fix it. Now, Trump has been in office 1 week and touted the mandate given to him in the recent presidential election, where a whopping 49.8% of Americans supported his vision for the country. And with that mandate, he began a flurry of executive orders, renaming mountains and bodies of water, declaring two genders in this country, and ending birthright citizenship granted by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which he can't really do. But is this reflective of the mandate given to him by voters? Do I even need to say it? We're going to break down the reasons why people voted for Trump and what exactly they voted him in for. But first, so Shawn, we are past the first week of Trump's second term, and I think we're going to have a challenge because there's the thing that we should be talking about. It's going to happen every week. It's going to be the thing we should be talking about. And then there's going to be the thing we want to talk about, but really shouldn't talk about because it distracts from the other thing.
Right.
So we got to talk about the thing we shouldn't talk about, which is Elon Musk's.
Well, it's hard not to talk about this because it made international news. It was so in your face for people. The BBC was talking about it. They were talking about it over in Germany, where making that hand gesture is illegal.
Yes.
Let's be honest. That was a Nazi salute if I've ever seen one in my life.
Without a doubt. And I think this goes back to Trump's first term, where he would say or insinuate something that everybody's against. So let's be clear. People on the right are anti-Nazi, but they would argue about whether this was for their values or against their values. So in this case, the argument is, was it a Hitler salute? Was it a Roman salute? Here's the way I look at it. Hitler ruined a lot of things for everybody. Yeah. He ruined the Hitler mustache, right? He ruined the name Hitler, right? Yeah. And he ruined the Roman salute. You cannot do a Roman salute anymore thanks to Hitler, just like you can't wear your shoes through the metal detector in an airport, right?
Well, historically speaking, the Roman salute was always a fascist salute to begin with. So but of course, then there's the history of the Bellamy salute in the United States, which is how people used to, during the Pledge of Allegiance, they used to do a very similar hand motion in this country. And then it was changed around the time of World War II because World War II veterans said it's too much like what the Nazis were doing. And so, look, I am willing to give the benefit of doubt to Elon Musk that he wasn't giving that intentionally to be a Nazi salute. I'm willing to extend the benefit of doubt. But I think the thing that I'm tired of explaining to people is that hand gesture is never appropriate, no matter setting or context.
Well, that's it. I think the way I heard it explained best was by a comedian I follow on Twitter, of all places, Mike Birbiglia, who said, if you don't think that was a Nazi salute, do it tomorrow at work.
Yeah.
And I think that pretty much answers it. Honestly, I think that he was doing a Nazi salute. I don't think he's a Nazi. I think he is just the ultimate troll.
Yeah.
And honestly, with that in context, I think it would be less annoying if he was a Nazi. And this gets back to Trump's first term and how this term is going to be a repeat of that, which is that every week there will be a new controversy du jour, and all the oxygen will be consumed by people debating it.
Right.
And the goal isn't to necessarily get an answer to that debate. It's merely to provide cover for everything else that's going on. Now, oddly enough, Elon's salute actually overshadowed all the other things that were being done for cover for all the other things that are going on. And so in Trump's first week in office, signed a series of executive orders, also started moving towards implementing his more hardline immigration policies. And again, the big question here is this actually what put him into office? Is this the stuff that the plurality of voters in America voted for? And so a lot of what we're going to discuss today is derived from Echelon Insights. Every month they put out a really good survey. It's the Verified Voter Omnibus. And so we pulled the one from November of 2024. So the month of the election, to understand where American voters are, how they were voting, and what they were thinking about when they went to the ballot box, right? Now, big surprise, none of the issues that we're talking about this week were issues that really drove people ultimately to vote for Trump. Mm-hmm. And for the sake of this conversation, as always, we're going to break down the electorate not into Republican, Democrat, left and right, but into smaller subgroups. And to keep things super simple for everybody, we have your diehard conservatives who are socially, fiscally conservatives. We have your progressives, socially and fiscally liberal. And then we've got people in between. So we have leaners. These are people who are independents, but typically will vote either Democrat or Republican. They're not necessarily diehard. They're not necessarily totally aligned with the party, but they vote that way out of opposition to the other party. We have your true independents. These are people who have no allegiance and are totally disgusted with the two-party system. And then we have this group we keep going back to, the populists. And these are people who tend to be a little more socially conservative, economically liberal, and primarily driven by economic issues. And so we're going to kind of break apart the electorate like this and explain who voted for whom, why they voted, and kind of build a picture of what Trump's mandate actually is. Now, if we look at all voters, top 3 issues were cost of living, jobs in the economy, and healthcare. Those are the top 3 issues. Any idea where immigration, DEI, or other culture war issues landed, Shawn, on the survey?
If I had to guess, I would say immigration probably somewhere in the mid-tier of priorities because it was such a big issue. Mm-hmm. But things like DEI and transgender and culture stuff, I have to imagine is pretty low on the totem pole.
Very low, very low. Immigration was actually down there too. But now here's the funny thing is if you go back and look at polling data going all the way back, I went all the way back to Bill Clinton's first election in 92. Jobs in the economy, healthcare, and education are always the top 3. This is interesting because we had cost of living, of course, because we had an inflation in there. So that makes sense. Now,
that's the economy, stupid, right? That's the saying, right?
That's exactly it. It is the economy, stupid. And when we go into kind of how these different subgroups voted, we get a better picture as to what put them in office. So, of course, you had your diehard conservatives, right? These people are all over Trump's executive orders. Those executive orders were written for these people. Mm-hmm. Now, according to Echelon Insights, they're about 20% of the population. Not enough to win an election, Shawn, in case you were slow at math. And this is a group that swung 85% for Trump. So overwhelmingly for Trump. Now, Trump needs to add more than just the diehard conservatives. So the next group that swung heavily for Trump were the economic populists. These folks are about 25% of the electorate, according to Echelon Insights. 70% swung for Trump, right? So that's the second largest group. Now, their main concerns are cost of living, jobs, and trade. So to an extent, some of Trump's tariffs talks may be appealing to them, but it truly is cost of living issues that are driving their vote right now. And it's still a little early in his administration to give him an economic record. But the bottom line is that this is why these people voted him into office. And I think it could be argued that these people aren't people whose votes the Republicans can take for granted.
I agree with this idea that there was a mandate that voters sent, and it's a very similar mandate that's sent in every single election at this point, and that is, please do something about the economy. and not just make sure that the economy is strong, because under Biden nationally, the economy was getting stronger, right? GDP was up, Wall Street, the Dow was up, all that, record highs and stuff like that. When you look at the big picture national scale, the economy is doing well under Biden, but who is it doing well for? Who is the economy serving? And at the end of the day, it has always been about, we want an economy and we want a country that serves us, that puts us first, and they're just not seeing it. Voters aren't seeing it.
We can definitely talk about the Democratic disconnect on that too, and we've talked about it before, which is,
right.
If you heard the Democratic message throughout the election, it was that the economy wasn't doing bad, that the economy was good.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is, when prices go up and they stay up, the economy isn't good for people, right? If you were just eking by prior to inflation, the economy's not good for you.
Right.
And I think they really came off as tone deaf. Now, the interesting thing is that when I started to look into some of Trump's more divisive policies, you start to see that a lot of those policies actually aren't all that popular. So a great example is Trump's mass deportation plan. Now, there was a poll by Gallup done last year, and it showed a majority of Americans feel that we need additional curbs on immigration, about 51%. But when it comes down to how you do it, two of the top three measures were providing a pathway to citizenship for people here illegally if they met certain requirements, and doing the same for people brought here illegally as children. And way at the bottom, with a minority of support, was mass deportation. So pathway to citizenship for kids brought here illegally, 80% support. Pathway to citizenship for people here illegally, adults here illegally, 70% support. Mass deportations, 47% support. 47. Okay. And now the interesting thing is, a pathway to citizenship is actually a better economic policy for two reasons. First off, it costs less. So data from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget showed that providing a pathway to citizenship would save taxpayers $260 billion. Trump's measures, like the border wall, tightening border security, would actually cost taxpayers $180 billion. So it's cheaper. Part two is the economic impacts of mass deportation are huge. So in all the sectors that undocumented immigrants work in, costs would go up. Now, I'm not making an argument for depressed wages by any means, but what I'm saying is that there's a definite economic blowback to this policy when a pathway to citizenship would be cheaper. The other thing I'll say is that this economic blowback is especially acute in rural districts where agriculture dominates the economy. So as of now, about 40% of the agricultural workforce are undocumented immigrants. You take them out, and that causes a huge problem for American farmers as well as for food prices overall. So I think the tall and short of it is, we have a policy that is unpopular, that costs more than popular alternatives being implemented because Trump wants to cater to his base.
Right. Yeah. He made all these promises on the campaign trail. And Trump is the type of guy who wants to say, hey, I kept my campaign promises. That was a big thing for him after his first term. Is like, hey, I did what I said I was going to do. The problem, though, is he's prioritizing the wrong things, because he also promised to make living more affordable. He promised to lower the cost of gas, lower the cost of grocery prices. Instead of prioritizing that, he's prioritizing the 20% of hardline conservatives who wanted the hardline approach to immigration, including signing an executive order that is clearly unconstitutional in the birthright citizenship thing, targeting transgender who make up less than 2% of the population, targeting DEI in the federal workplace. So all economic stuff he's pushed in the background, and that's not the mandate that he was given. But the way that he looks at a mandate is that, well, I was elected, so I can kind of do what I want.
Yeah, and to an extent, he's right. So if we just go back to that immigration issue for a second, pathway to citizenship, highly popular with voters on the whole.
Hmm.
But when you break it down by party, so when you break it down by Democrats, Republicans, and independents, hugely unpopular with Republicans. And the inverse is also true for mass deportation. Really popular amongst Republicans, very unpopular with independents and Democrats. And so what that shows you is that the way we elect candidates, the fact that in order for anybody to make it to the general election, they need to go through a partisan primary, is how that distorts the incentives of those in office, because
Hmm.
Trump can issue a policy that's largely unpopular, but unpopular with his base, and actually strengthen his position.
Well, I think a good example of this is looking at his January 6 pardons and how a lot of Republicans have changed their tune on him pardoning some of the more violent members of the January 6th
Yeah.
incident at the Capitol. Some Republicans have called him out, but there have been some Republicans who have changed their tune on whether or not the sweeping pardons is which was what we saw should have happened or not, and that's because they're at a point where they're afraid of getting on the bad side of Trump, which might mean getting on the bad side of that 20% of hardline conservatives who are more likely to vote in these party primaries. And the biggest threat to their continued political career is the primary elections, is getting past the primaries. In most cases, if they can get past the primary, they sell back into reelection.
Yeah. I think the scary thing about those pardons are the more violent folks who were let off the hook. So I think
Mm,
if you climbed through a window on the Capitol and walked around and took a couple of selfies, yes, you committed a crime. Should you go to federal prison for it? I don't
right.
know. I mean, if he wants to pardon those people, whatever.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like I don't approve of it, but I'm also like not necessarily against it.
Right.
You get to some of the more violent folks, and you get to some of the more violent organized folks, such as the head of the Proud Boys, or I think the one I'm most worried about is Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, because his role was scary. So, first off, the guy is a Yale Law School grad, so no dummy, knows the law. And because he knew the law, he had members of the Oath Keepers stockpile weapons in hotels right over the Potomac River in Virginia, where that was legal. And he did it so in the event Trump declared martial law, they could come into DC armed to the teeth. And that's scary. I think the thing that bothers me is part of the reason too why these issues are not creating a bigger stir is because they're low priority issues amongst voters.
Right.
So getting back to like what I said earlier, how DEI issues, immigration issues are relatively low in terms of priority amongst most voters. That also means they're not paying attention
Right.
when those policies are enacted upon. And January 6th is one of those examples. Voters just care more about the economy than they do about democracy. They do.
Yeah.
And they care more about it than January 6th. And I think the thing that concerns me is you have people who are okay using violence, who are organized, and who are very, very closely aligned ideologically with the president. And given that he can't constitutionally serve another term, I wouldn't necessarily say that we're headed for an all out violent overthrow of the American government. But what I would say is he certainly hasn't put us any further away from it.
Although I did you hear about the resolution that was introduced in the House
No.
to amend the Constitution to allow Trump to have a third term, or Trump or any future president to run for a third term. And part of that is, again, speaking to that 20% that is going to be deciding the future of these politicians' political futures in the next 4 years while Trump is still in office. But I also think part of that gets to something we talked about before. And that is, what exactly does the Republican Party do post Trump? Who do they turn to? What is that leadership structure going to look like? Again, it's just the incentive structure is so out of sync with the American people in our politics that we're going to see a lot of distractions. We're going to see a lot of issues that Americans don't care about that could be consequential to certain communities and certain groups. but they're not going to be the thing that turns voters.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, first off, if Republicans want Trump to run again, be my guest. Nominate an 82-year-old man. I mean, we already know how that plays out, right? If I were the Democrats, I'd be licking my lips over that prospect. Of course, the flip side is I think the only party that could potentially lose to an 80-year-old Trump would be the Democratic Party. So there's that. But I think, you bring up an interesting point here, which is all Republicans, Trump included, need the support of that 20% of diehard conservatives to make it on the ballot.
Right.
They need their support.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, they need to figure out a way to pull other people in. And to an extent, I think via some cultural overtures that tend to resonate with the more socially conservative crowd, and also with just the state of the economy, I think those two things work to Trump's advantage in this case. Not by much. Like, again, let's keep in mind, this election was not that much different than 2016 in terms of turnout, in terms of margins, all that. Like, it wasn't a landslide by any stretch of the imagination. But I think this gets back to the way that more popular policies are boxed out by the current system, because ultimately I need to provide that red meat to the base, regardless of how unpopular it might be. And especially we get back to immigration. The reality is Trump's immigration policy is economically damaging. It is more expensive. There are better ways to do that, but those solutions won't ever make it to the top because Trump has no incentive to find out what the majority of Americans think. If we go back to the poll from Echelon Insights, the overwhelming majority of voters are concerned about the same things. And the overwhelming majority of voters are for policies that just are not bubbling to the surface. So allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, campaign finance reform. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah, it's interesting because the economic consequences of some of these immigration policies from Trump, I think, are actually preventing some of them from fully going into effect. Right? Even when you watch the media, they'll focus a lot about the separation of families and things like that, and that's terrible, right? People will think that's terrible.
Yeah.
But talk about what that's going to do to their wallets, right? When they go to buy produce, right? When they go to buy all these other things that have required labor from migrants and immigrants, right? And that will really hit harder or hit more home with people, I think.
Yeah, agreed there. And so I think the takeaway here is that of the things that people are going to talk about the most over the next 4 years, none of these are the things that win elections, and none of these are the reasons why Trump is in office. And ultimately, his political fate is going to lie in whether Americans feel more well off under his leadership than they did under Biden's, and whether they feel more well off at the end of his term than they did at the beginning of the term. And that remains to be seen. But the rest of this is just a sideshow.
Right. Mark Cuban actually posted this recently on Blue Sky, and he had advice for Democrats, and he said that if you want to win, if you want to beat Trump, you have to start speaking to individual voter issues. You have to start responding to what voters are saying, individual voters are saying, rather than speaking in unison. And I think that is the biggest message, is that Republicans are speaking to a 20% of hardline conservatives because they have to win primaries. Democrats are so focused on their party speaking in unison on everything. They focus solely on, we are a party of a unison voice, and you speak to that voice or we're going to ostracize you completely, like the Kristen Cinemas, like the Joe Manchins, like you. We are not. Yeah, you are going to be pushed out. So.
And I think more importantly, they need to have a policy that isn't a reaction to every crazy thing Trump does.
Yeah.
They need to be selling something to Americans, because Americans are voting for something.
Yeah.
Right?
We've spoke about this before, but I think the cruxes to the Harris campaign was she kind of had to make this a referendum on Trump. She couldn't say anything that went against her own administration, anything about ways that they could make the economy better or speak more directly to the needs of middle-class Americans who were still struggling. They need to have a message where it's solution-oriented rather than the other side is so evil, you can't vote for them.
They don't want the best. They want the least worst.
Right.
And I think we're going to leave it there. Shawn, we're going to start a new end of episode tradition, which is telling people what they can do to get better choices on the ballot and get better people into office. And there are a few organizations we can highlight. One is Rank the Vote, promotes ranked choice voting nationwide. Be sure to check them out. Fair Vote has a whole bunch of information on different electoral reform initiatives, national and state. And then lastly, Fix Our House, which is devoted to implementing proportional representation across the United States. Check out those three if you're interested in learning more. Thank you very much for listening. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to rate this episode, leave a review, and share this with anyone you think might like it too. The music you're hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you once more for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.